welcome to the H-Frame podcast. My very special guest is Michał Oleszczyk, my old friend and former student of mine, but a man who's gone on to do great things and probably one of the most important film critics in Poland, and not only Poland, in the world. And very proud of that. Michał, how you doing? You ready to talk about Pauline Kael?
I am, and it's great to see you. And too kind in your introduction, but thank you. And
Okay.
yeah, sure. I'll be happy to talk about Pauline Kael and other stuff. It's great to see you. It's been a while since we saw each other live, but the
Yeah,
pandemics sort of made it difficult to move.
yeah. Okay, but Pauline Kael was the topic of your PhD, so it's a familiar topic for you. But first of all, maybe we can talk about your background and I guess how we got to know each other. Where did we meet? How was that? Do you remember that?
I do remember it because the first time I met you was actually as a teacher, and it was even before I got associated with, the American Studies department.
Mhm.
Actually, a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, Alicia,
Uh-huh.
she was a student at that time. She was your student, and she told me that
Okay.
there are those really interesting lectures on the Cold War, and I started to attend them with her, probably illegally, I think. And I remember that I was really captivated. I really, I really enjoyed the class, and I liked the way that you were talking about history as if it was happening in the moment. I mean, it wasn't like a dry academic kind of thing. It was really engaging, and I enjoyed that class. And then I became part of the department because I actually did my PhD program at the American Studies department, which, by the way, was a complete accident because the only reason that I was sort of in trouble at the time was that I originally wanted to do my PhD at the film studies department, but the
Uh-huh.
film studies department didn't start a PhD program the year that I was about to. And someone told me, you're interested in American film, maybe your PhD could be in American studies. And I said, yeah, maybe I will check it out. And then that's how I ended up at the department. That's how I ended up, going on scholarships, enjoying it, the whole department, and teaching there also later on, at TAS, Transatlantic
Yeah.
Studies. So that was, sometimes those accidental, events actually turn out very well, so that's how it was.
Well, I remember you were in my seminar and
Yeah, and then I remember that you were teaching classes that were focused on specific decades of American film. You did 1960s, you did 1970s, and I was helping you with the technical side of things by, showing the films that you wanted to show from.
yeah, and I still do that. I still do those technical decades. And we talked about the Rockford Files. And you
Well,
asked me,
wait,
yeah, you
you
asked me,
made me
yeah,
aware of the show. I never heard of the show before, and I think it was. I'm afraid of actually to think how long ago it was, but it was
a
something
long
like
time ago. Yeah.
2009. You mentioned Rockford Files, and I remember I never heard of the show before, and I checked it out. I bought it on DVD, and then I watched the whole thing, and it was amazing. I love the show now. I'm very 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 fond of it.
I think Jim Rockford was a great American character, and he's a little bit. You even said Pauline Kael was referenced in the Rockford Files. How was that?
I think in season four, one of the dates, one of the young girls that Jim Rockford dates, or at least he talks to her. She says that,
Yeah,
"Oh, I was just reading this Pauline Kael book," so I
yeah,
I found that amusing. But that tells you that she was Pauline Kael. She was known, like it wasn't like some obscure reference to someone nobody knew. I think that was a
yeah.
reference to someone that people were aware of. That she was out there.
And Pauline Kael. So why don't we get started on Pauline Kael? Why should we know about her? Why is she important in cultural history? And even you know, she's important enough to be referenced in a Rockford Files episode, and she wrote for the New Yorker, and she's gone down in history as a very important film critic. But why is she just not another film critic? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I have with me a copy of the New Yorker, actually, actual copy of the
Yeah.
New Yorker from '74. So that was time when that was the time when Pauline Kael was writing for the New Yorker. You know, if I were to give one single reason to why Pauline Kael is important, I would say because she is a great writer.
Hmm.
That's the main
Hmm.
reason. I mean, her prose, her writing style, the agility of her mind, and her fearlessness. I mean, she
Hmm.
was just one of the great American writers of the 20th century. And and you know, this is where the conversation needs to start. You know, because otherwise, I don't think I would have ever committed as much, time to exploring someone, because I sensed it when I was reading her stuff, that this is a brilliant mind, and I don't think that we have anyone of her class like nowadays. Really, I mean, I think that
Yeah.
she was probably the most brilliant mind ever applied to the cinema.
Okay. So why don't we back up a little bit and let's talk about her background? You obviously know a lot about her. She's originally from Poland, right? And
Well,
what's that story? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I did some research, and
Yeah.
even the biography that came out a couple of years ago, the Brian Kellow biography, just
Yeah.
makes a very, like cursory mention of this,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
her parents were Polish Jews. She
Yeah.
was born in California, but
Hmm.
I was always fascinated by this, like, so okay, so where they were from, like where
Yeah.
exactly they came
Yeah.
from. I managed to contact Gina James, who is Pauline's daughter. She lives in Great Barrington,
Hmm.
Massachusetts, and I met her. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman, and she gave me some information. I will actually, if I may, I will read
Sure.
like four sentences from the email that Gina sent me, which actually
Please. Please.
is
Yeah.
about Pauline's
Yeah.
roots and Gina's roots as well.
Yeah.
So I'm quoting from the email. Pauline's maternal grandfather, Ben Zion Friedman, was the son of Joseph Friedman and Rose, without last name, we don't know it. Ben Zion
Oh,
Friedman lived in Warsaw. He was born in 1862, and he married Esther Nina Berman, who was born in 1864, who was from another well-to-do family in Warsaw. So both of her parents actually were from
yeah.
Warsaw. Ben Zion worked for the Polish king. Now, Poland didn't have a king at the time. There was no Poland. So I guess he
Yeah.
probably worked for somebody very important, or from the Russian Tsar. Who
Very
knows?
good. Yeah.
Um, so and was in charge of his warehouses. The king, whoever that was, gave him a charter to sail with a group of Jews, including his wife's brothers, to South America. And actually, their first place of arrival was South America. They sailed to Argentina around 1893. Pauline's mother, Jetta, Judith, was about 8 years old when the family moved from Warsaw to Argentina, where they bought land and raised crops, probably wheat. So Jetta loved to ride astride a horse over the plains, the Pampas. Her parents never wanted to return to Poland. The crops were fruitful until the locusts came 3 years in a row, eating everything, leaving nothing to replant. Their supplies were too low, so Ben Zion, his family, and those who chose to join him returned to Poland. The Berman brothers chose to stay and move to Buenos Aires. Yetta's sister Jenny continued to get letters from the Berman brothers, who said they became prominent as jurist and doctor. And then, they moved to United States. And Pauline's name, actually, her parents' name was Klotz. So it was
Okay.
Isaac Klotz, and it was like a Ellis Island name that they got Kale.
Okay.
So that's
Okay.
the deep backstory of that emigration.
And they eventually ended up in California in a place called Petaluma, which I know well. I worked for a summer in Petaluma. It's a kind of a that time probably a agricultural chicken farming town known for chickens. It was just north of San Francisco. How did she end up in Petaluma?
Well, that's where she was born, actually. That was Petaluma.
Yeah,
So her
yeah.
parents moved there, and there started a chicken farm. So they were chicken farmers, and this is where she grew up. And this place formed her in many ways, and she refers to her childhood, spent on a farm, in California, which I think set her, light years apart from, sort of pampered children of the eastern, coast
Yeah.
elite, which she was always a little bit at odds with. So she was a California farm girl in many ways.
And Petaluma at that time, it's just north of San Francisco. It's a tough town. We'll get to it, but in her review of HUD, I know she talks about how her brothers used to, chase greased pigs. So she didn't have a typical Ivy League upbringing, and she was a working girl as a young person. And then when eventually she moved on to Berkeley, she never forgot those roots. And I think in her writing style and even her personality, she kept that idea that she wasn't an East Coast elite writer. She was something different. What do you think about that? Was that accurate?
I think
She had this.
that's the key thing
Mm,
about her to understand, and from that very polar opposite of her
mhm,
being, this Western
uh-huh,
girl, and
yeah,
her writing for the New Yorker, which was like the very epitome of
yeah,
the Eastern, coast
yeah,
refinement. I mean, that was very adventurous of William Shawn to give her that job, because and of course, later on they were often, butting heads, because they were very different in, like, upbringing and like, demeanor. But that was brilliant of him, because really it was wonderful to, there were those like polar opposites that generated sparks. And I think, she never completely saw herself as part of the New York elite, even though she spent, so much time there.
okay, maybe we can talk about just before we get to New York. She studied at Berkeley. She's just a philosophy student,
Yeah.
and she got her first writing job with City Lights, which was kind of part of the Beat movement, right? The Beatnik movement in San Francisco in the early mid 1950s. She gets a job there. She reviews a Charlie Chaplin film. She doesn't like it, but
Mhm.
she's actually pretty honest in what she doesn't like, and that's kind of sets the tone for her style later on, right? She's pretty earthy, she's very honest, and she writes in the beat movement that she uses street language. She doesn't use the refined
Mhm.
language of the East Coast Ivy League schools, right? So
Yeah.
she comes out of Berkeley in the 1950s. That's important, I think.
Of course. I mean, amazingly well read as well. I mean, when
Yeah,
we talk
yeah,
about her, about, the California farm girl,
yeah.
that was there, but at the same time, she was extremely well read. I mean, at times
Mhm,
she's shockingly well read, and besides, she
mhm,
had something like almost total recall. Like she mentioned that sometimes that she had a total recall of movies and of books, that she really, she could have quoted from books that she read many many years before, and that was something that was very specific to her intelligence. And in the
and
50s, in San Francisco, she was also running an art house theater. She was programming it,
mhm.
so she was part of a very bohemian, open, very liberal, left wing, intelligentsia, as we say in these parts. Yeah.
And in Petaluma, I mean, even if she was living in a chicken farm, she was reading Henry James, Proust, Melville, and she was very well versed in the literature that would kind of define her style a little bit. That edgy, kind of adventurous. I've lived a lifestyle. I'm not an academic. I'm something different. And I think she got that at Berkeley, and that showed in her work. And she was also on the radio at Berkeley, right? She was a film critic on the radio.
The film
Yeah.
critic, and that actually went on for a couple of years. Then she famously quit over the fact that she didn't get paid for that. She said that I cannot afford this anymore. Like, I cannot afford
Well,
to spend, as much time as I do and not getting paid for it. Because of course it was also, there's this, definitely she had harder time because she was a woman. She needed to assert her voice against quite a big array of male writers who still considered, film criticism and, sort of like a boys club. So she needed to assert herself. What you said about literature, I think, is extremely important. She was famously a huge fan of Henry James. Everything that he ever wrote, she says, she's just a deep literary culture and the ability to actually combine this sort of almost rough idiom, of someone who doesn't care about the, niceties with an extremely sharp, beautiful style. I think that's very much present in her writing.
And she's got guts, and she doesn't want to be an academic. She says, I'm tired of academia. She doesn't trust academia, and I think that's part of her personality. She doesn't trust any kind of uppity kind of attitude, and I think that defines her style when she goes national. And I think even in Berkeley, a lot of her early style was tweaking or at least poking fun at the kind of overly refined East Coast film critics, right? And she did that almost like they were her foil. Is that correct? Yeah.
Absolutely, and what she really hated was that still a lingering sense, and lingering prejudice against movies. Even the writers at the time, like Bosley Crowther, times
Yeah.
who was her arch enemy, or at least her
Yeah.
favorite aim of her jokes. So those people were formed, and you can sense that in the first wave of American film criticism, that they still a little bit superior to the art. They it's like,
Sure.
oh, the movies, like it's not the theater, it's not
It's not the
literature.
theater.
So, but really, her real predecessor in this sort of, you know allowing the vernacular to really punch up the prose was Otis Ferguson, whom is really quite forgotten nowadays. And I would love to read
Yeah.
him because he was
Yeah.
writing in the 1930s, and I think he's the direct predecessor to Kael. And she admitted his influence. He brought in this sort of big city, smart reporter kind of style to the movies. Like, I'm a reporter, I'm in the big city, and I'm reporting from the front line of film. So there's no nonsense, very pithy, very like witty way of writing. And she admitted that Otis Ferguson was one of her influences. So, and she brought that, but she also expanded it a lot.
And I think that's important because everybody needs influences, and she had an earthy kind of plain spoken style. I think her first influences in the film were like screwball comedies, the Marx Brothers, that sort of thing. So definitely not European sophistication. So in about 1960, she goes national. Now, where does she go to become a national figure in the early 1960s?
The key time, which is sort of like the defining moment for her, is mid 60s. And I
Yeah.
think there are two moments to understand. 1965, her review for her review of The Sound of Music, which she
Mm.
hated, and she printed the review was, I think, for McCall's, if I'm not mistaken. And she was
Yeah.
fired for that review because she offended the readers, because
Yeah.
the way she berated the film. So that's 1965, and The Sound of Music is probably the epitome of what Hollywood was trying to, from the old time wholesomeness of the movies. A singing nun,
Mhm.
a singing
Mhm.
nun is like the epitome of clean pictures. And they
Yeah.
gave it
Yeah.
Oscar. It was the and she hated it because she hated wholesomeness in film. She hated the sort of squeaky clean, Hollywood product. And then 2 years later, she reviews Bonnie and Clyde, which, in terms of, if you put those two movies together, Sound of Music is miles, light years away from Bonnie and Clyde.
Why don't we talk about that? Because the rumor, the legend is that she got fired for giving Sound of Music a bad review at McCall's magazine. Now,
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that how hard it was for women to get into big time kind of film or any kind of cultural reviews at that time. And there was a trend and where you had people like Irma Birnbach and Jean Kerr talking about how hard it was to be a suburban woman. They weren't Betty Friedan. This was something different. They were from small towns in Pennsylvania or Petaluma or Iowa. And they're talking about how boring it is to be a housewife, but they don't do it from the Ivy League point of view or the Betty Friedan point of view. They do it from kind of like I'm smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day at the kitchen table point of view, and I'm trying to cook for my husband who's going to come home and I'm really bored point of view. And I
Right.
think Pauline Kael has that attitude where I'm smarter than people think I am, but it's also kind of boring out there in suburbia. So Bonnie and Clyde is a good film. So she reviews this film for New York Magazine. Is that right? And they don't take it.
Well, no, the
New Republic. I'm
New
sorry. I
Republic,
think.
she was also involved with the New Republic, but my knowledge, the piece on Pauline Kael was assigned to her by the New Yorker, I think, but it was her
Okay.
first
Yeah.
piece. I'm like 80%
Yeah.
sure. The thing is that the movie was already reviewed negatively by New York Times and several other outlets, and it was a movie that was about to sink, because. Warner Brothers, the very studio that produced it, they didn't believe in it. They hated it actually.
Why?
Warren Beatty was the producer of it, but the studio was Warner Brothers, and they didn't like what they saw. When they saw the movie, so they were trying to sink it by like pulling it from theaters, like playing it only in small towns.
And because maybe we need to back up for our general audience, because this is not a film audience, this is a general audience. Why is Bonnie and Clyde important as a cultural milestone in cinema? It was part of this what was called New Hollywood, right? And
Mhm.
that's Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. It comes out in 1967, 68, and it kind of that's the height of the counterculture in music and in pop culture and that sort of thing. But it hits cinema, and Pauline Kael is credited with really bringing some sort of credibility to New Hollywood.
Yeah,
Is that?
and that her biggest like influence on actual cinema,
Yeah,
not on
yeah,
journalism but on cinema.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably we could talk for another hour about Bonnie and Clyde, but the importance of Bonnie and Clyde really was that it introduced a new kind of sensibility, or rather, it articulated a specific
Hmm.
sensibility that was very much in the air at the time. The poster
Yeah,
for the film famously advertised the movie with the tagline, "They are young, they are in love, they are killing people. They kill people." It
yeah,
was fun, like it was what was sexy about them, that they're young,
yeah,
in love,
yeah,
and they
yeah,
kill people.
yeah.
When you look at Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty, they don't look anything like the real Bonnie and Clyde. Like they're
Nothing, nothing.
movie star, beautiful.
Yeah,
She is clad in those Theodora Van Winkle, outfits, and she looks fantastic, like a fashion model. They brought this new, also European, because they were deeply influenced by New Wave, by French New
ah,
Wave, this sort of new sexiness to outlaws and they became really the figures of the outlaw, and of the whole counterculture. And it's funny because it all begins with the script by Robert Benton and Newman, who
yeah,
were writing for the Esquire at the time. Very hip. They
yeah.
knew what was exciting about the new French film, and they sort of translated it with Arthur Penn, the director, into this new and exciting kind of movie making, which many mainstream reviewers didn't understand, didn't get.
No,
Bosley Crowder was sort of a fuddy
yeah.
duddy, in the New York Times, and Pauline Kael was alive to it. She saw that this is actually an important film, so she
Okay.
wrote this huge review for the New Yorker. I mean, nobody would publish it today. It's such a long essay, yeah, and it was enthusiastic.
In her reviews, she was famous for her plain spoken language, but it was also she was kind of fiercely American in some ways, that she didn't want to be influenced by Fellini and the French New Wave. She was kind of skeptical of that. Is that true? Like she was a little bit,
Tipping point. There's a tipping
yeah,
point
yeah,
there.
yeah,
She
yeah,
loved some of Godard. She loved some
yeah,
early stuff. She makes this violent, turn at some point. Like those guys anymore,
yeah.
but also they are making some turns towards really political. But yeah, I mean, she really liked the American vernacular. She loved writers like Chandler, McCain, the beauty of American casualness. And it's funny, in the Bonnie and Clyde review, she actually, I love that sentence. It's almost untranslatable, but she says that Bonnie and Clyde is the most excitedly American film of the year. She uses the word American twice, and that tells you that she really valued the Americanness of it.
Why don't we go back to her New Yorker days? Because I want to talk about why the New Yorker is such an important venue for writers at that time. Because in these days, we have so much access to everything. Back then, New Yorker was the thinking person's magazine and that sort of thing. So she was never a really easy fit there. But what about like Fellini 8.5 and HUD? She really liked this film with Paul Newman that came out in 1963 called HUD, which is one of my personal favorite films.
Yeah.
And it was a very raw film starring Paul Newman and Patricia O'Neill. And it's a beautiful film in a way, but it was also a very uncomfortable film. And I think that was even before Bonnie and Clyde, that we're getting in towards a new era of cinema. Do you know anything about that review she did for HUD?
Well, I love that piece, and it's a piece that shows her in her full fighting mode. She encourages the Eastern critics who didn't like the movie. She outright identifies herself as a, you know, Western girl, who grew up on a farm. She writes about her brothers, wrestling with pigs, and I love it. It's a complicated piece, which is about many things. It's also about American politics, and she basically says that Hollywood is at war with itself because Hollywood wants to be a very liberal, cultured city, but at the same time, it's almost afraid of its own audience. Like it's afraid of people like Had, like the main character of the movie. And she actually says that it's the one of the most exciting schizoid movies of our time, because she says the people who are making it don't really know what to make of this character of Had. Like, do we condone him? Do we hate him? She puts a finger on something very important about Hollywood, I think,
And why don't we back up a little bit, because we have to, if nobody's aware of Pauline Kael, a lot of times her reviews of films were about much more than the film. She would stretch out her legs and talk about social criticism, politics, all of that stuff that was happening in 1963, right about the time Kennedy was shot. There was the Goldwater Johnson election, and she brings that up in a movie review, which is kind of interesting at the time and not done. That was kind of she was really extending her venue into something different than just film. And HUD, if people haven't seen the film, and I'm assuming that a lot of people viewing this, Michał, haven't seen HUD. What's HUD about? It's not a Western. It's set in the modern Western of Texas in 1963, and it's a very contemporary film, and it's a disturbing film. What's it about? And Paul Newman is the star, and he's kind of the first anti-hero of the 60s in a way, in some ways.
Basically about this young man Had, who is the local nihilist in a way,
for sure.
Very sure of himself. He's played by Paul Newman, so he immediately has our attention, and sympathy, I think. Basically, it shows this conflict between him and his father, playing with this old Hollywood dignity by Douglas, and his name Homer. So it tells you right there that he's important. And and there's this character played by Brendan the Wild, who was the young boy in Shane. Basically, the movie is about like the deterioration of the small community. I would say that it's like there are seeds of Last Picture Show in this small community, which once was held by a very strict moral code, probably also by religious conviction, and then it's sort of disintegrating because there's not enough like social glue, to keep it together. And Had is like the epitome of this crisis, but at the same time, he's a very attractive figure to the viewer. Like that's the basics of it, I would say.
It's about the time we get Joe Namath and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. All of that happens in the same year, 63, 64. And Paul Newman is he's an anti-hero. He's a terrible person in a way, but he's also attractive, and that's a complicated theme for most New York film reviewers, but not for Pauline Kael. She loved it.
She loved, although she loved it in her own way, which was like saying that some things about this movie are different. They are the evidence of the filmmaker's cluelessness about what they were talking about. But I really appreciated the portrait of this world that she knew so well. And this is the piece in which really she goes after the Eastern critics. She really says like, it's absurd to be piling on all those messages or meanings upon the character of Had. For me, the best thing about the review is the final paragraph when she basically says that She goes against the grain of her own caste, in a way. She says what she says is that many intellectuals, left-leaning intellectuals, which she was herself by as a person of the left, but
Yeah.
she was definitely seeing that there's this schizophrenic quality about the left-wing intellectuals who were living very, very well, on their university jobs, and at the same time berating the system that basically secured their affluence. So she was alive to that paradox. She never let herself, slip and forget about it. So
And we have a cultural transition here in 1963 when HUD comes out. Kennedy is shot at Thanksgiving weekend of 1963, or about that time. There's a transition to Johnson, and there's an election with Barry Goldwater, who is an ultimate libertarian. And there's a lot of libertarian themes in HUD, right? There's a government intervention about what can you describe the situation with the cattle? Well, they had hoof and mouth disease, and the government said you have to kill these cows, and HUD was saying don't do it, don't do it, and the dad says we have to do it because we're responsible citizens, and HUD says to hell with that.
He identifies Kael for that reason and others as a potential Goldwater, voter. That's outright. Kael can stand for Barry Goldwater electorate.
Okay.
But what I really love about her, she was never susceptible to sentimental political rhetoric. She very much a person of the left, but of the, let's say, I think that anyone who was formed on American campus in 1930s probably was, more left-leaning than right-leaning. I mean, it was such a big influence. The socialist and left-leaning philosophies. So she would never identify, with the right-wingers, or even like with people like, William Buckley, like really a person of the left. But she also knew that the left is very susceptible to those pieties, which she was especially strong in her anti-Stalinist stance. She was very anti-Stalinist, and she was passionate about her review of the film Daniel, which was released in 1983. It's the movie about the Rosenberg trial. Well, in that review, there are echoes of arguments 3 decades old. She's
sure. Well, why don't we talk about that? Because if we want to get back to the Hollywood, the famous Hollywood 10 and Kazan naming names and all of that sort of thing, I think I could see what Pauline Kael would say about that. She says, I'm my own person and I say what I think. And one of the most admirable characteristics about her film reviews is that she was so independent. She says, you're not going to tell me how to think, and I don't care how other people think. I think how I think. And she was very famous for watching a film one time and writing a 8-page review.
Which is why the reviews are almost seismographic record of her responses towards them. She would be like, she would be berated on the internet for many reasons, but also because she spoiled the films. She revealed ending. The fanboys of today wouldn't let her do that.
Why would she be too controversial for today's audience? Why was she controversial back then? Because she was very opinionated, and one of the things about life is, man, there's a lesson about life is never apologize and keep moving forward. And I think that was her philosophy, but today that might not work. But in those days, she benefited.
I think she wouldn't survive the Twitter culture. I don't think any independent mind can really survive it. I mean, it's the whole cancel culture thing. I think it's on one hand, it's the fruit of actually addressing some horrible things from the past that happened and that we need to talk about. But on the other hand, it's really this sort of hammer that one hits you, it really hits you, and
which sounds a lot like Stalinism in a way.
I think there is this mentality of a purge, of a purge, that we need to purge the people and the minds that are unable, and that's very unfortunate. I was almost amused because when people were celebrating the 100th of anniversary of her birth, which was anyhow, that was the Kael century, and I thought to myself, like, all it would take would be to like write down 10 quotes from her reviews, and I could probably kill the celebration. There are quotes there that are really uncomfortable from the standpoint of today's,
Be-
Twitter culture.
because
And
she was her own person, and I think she really spoke. I think she wrote in pencil, right, in
mm,
longhand. She didn't know how to type, and
yeah,
she wrote in pencil.
her daughter typed her reviews for her,
And
Gina.
we'll get to Gina later, but she wrote in longhand, and I think she was very honest about what she thought. And these days, that's dangerous. But in 1969, 1968, when she was with the New Yorker, that was in style. She was part of this almost like new journalism, like the same thing at Hunter S. Thompson, Tom Wolfe, Jimmy Breslin,
Norman Mailer a little bit.
Norman Mailer, yeah, Joan Didion, and she liked boxing like Joan Didion. She liked combat. I think she was really into that.
But she hated Joan Didion, so I,
She
I
hated Joan Didion? Was
hated her. But
what was that relationship like? Yeah, I
well,
didn't
I
know
don't
that.
know much about the whole
Yeah,
relationship.
yeah.
But if you read her review of the film based on the Didion book, Play It
Okay.
As It Lays, like real hatred of John Didion.
Okay. Okay.
So I think they had very different sensibilities, and they both were California women,
Ah,
right?
maybe it's like Brzezinski and Kissinger. They're too close together, and they
Yeah.
have this rivalry.
And I
So
think Didion was more privileged. I
okay.
think Kael had to fight so much
No.
to preserve her livelihood. She
Yeah.
always
Yeah.
said that she was a seamstress. She babysat. She applied makeup to Sonia Henia, who was the ice skater, and she was 48 when she landed her New Yorker gig. She was
We should back up there, Michal, because that's really important. Because he wasn't part of this Eastern establishment where people get jobs. George Plimpton and David Halberstam, where they get these jobs very early, or even Gloria Steinem or whatever. They come out of these very exclusive schools and they get these very privileged positions. She had to wait till she was 45, 48, and she worked in menial labor as a single mother, right? And can you tell us something about that? What were some of her jobs?
father of Gina, James, is James
Yeah.
Broughton. He was
Oh,
an avant-garde filmmaker, actually a very good avant-garde filmmaker. But this relationship didn't last very long, and she was a single mom. She really and from what I know, and I think it's safe to mention it because it was also mentioned in the Kello book, is that
uh-huh.
Gina was of poor health, right? So she had to care for her, and there were these menial jobs. She was a seamstress, she was a babysitter. I think she worked in a pharmacy at some point. I know that she also applied makeup to Sonia Henia at the point. Even today, it's difficult to make your living when you are a
Yeah.
writer. And
Yeah.
then for a woman with a kid, then she went to New York. She came back to California. So it was. I'm always struck by what she says. I was 48 when I landed that job in the New Yorker. She said that she was on the verge of quitting. Actually, she was on the verge of saying, like, I'm tired of this. This is too much.
Oh,
And she always said that she really regrets that she really regretted that her best years were behind her, the years when she was most energetic. And she was plenty energetic in the 70s when she was 50 something. So I can imagine what a whirlwind of energy was she before that.
she must be an awkward situation. It seems like when she joins the New Yorker staff, and the New Yorker in 1967 and 1968 is still like a very genteel magazine of casual, upscale literature. You have John Updike doing his Rabbit in there. It's a very polite type of popular literature, but she breaks the seal a little bit. She's a little bit like J.D. Salinger, or
Mhm.
she's starting and it's very unusual for a woman at that time to speak her mind, and she spoke her mind in a very earthy way,
Mhm.
right? In a
Mhm.
very she even used profane language. She talked about sex a lot and kind of eroticism a lot, and that put her at odds with the famous editor of the New Yorker, William Shawn. And what was that relationship like? Why was she so much trouble for him?
Well, apparently there's enough material there to make a movie
Yeah,
about this
yeah,
relation. He was the sort of old school gentleman editor who was fantastic, and he really knew what good prose was, but he had those rather genteel standards. And
yeah,
her, as she referred to herself, that I came into the New Yorker wearing dung covered cowboy boots. She said,
yeah,
he scraped it off her pieces. They were
yeah.
fighting over single words. I think sometimes she lost the battle, sometimes she won. And
But for the fact that he was the editor and he says we can't put this in there,
yes, we can't put this
and
in there.
it,
One of
you
the
know,
reviews, she wanted to use the word pussy whipped, and I think he said no at that time.
can't do that.
Yeah, but there's still plenty of little, I think he was a good influence on her because maybe it was good that there was sort of a control over it, but they butted heads, and then she reviewed his son because Wallace Shawn, William, was in the movies, and she really liked the film that he co-wrote, which was My Dinner with
Yeah.
Andre. So,
Oh, let's get to that later because that's important. But I think I want to stay with this kind of femme fatale type of persona that she had going into the 1970s because one of her she hated Midnight Cowboy, which is interesting. Do you know anything about that? Because
I don't know if there was a separate review of Midnight Cowboy,
okay,
although you have mentioned it in passing, and I think that that she didn't like it. Probably
didn't like The Graduate,
she wasn't crazy about The Graduate.
but she loved Last Tango in Paris,
Yes, yes.
which was her signature review, right?
Yeah,
Going
it
into the
was
70s.
reprinted in total, like the whole review was reprinted as an ad in the New York Times, and it wasn't a
So
short review.
So our viewers don't know anything about Last Tango in Paris. Marlon Brando is in it. It's kind of the tail end of the sexual revolution, I guess. And why was that film so scandalous and why did she like it so much? I mean, it was really an important film in cultural terms, but some people were really uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, I mean, over the
Yeah,
year, more and more about
yeah,
sexual conduct that was
yeah.
that
My own
went on the
opinion.
set, and of course that that makes it into a definitely uncomfortable viewing. And besides, the incredibly violent reaction that the gossip press had against the actor
Yeah,
Maria Schneider, really
yeah,
berated, in the press of
yeah,
the time.
yeah, yeah,
It brought Marlon Brando the Oscar nomination. He was nominated
yeah,
for that. And the
yeah.
movie, Pauline Kael loved the movie. I think the movie itself is something of a funeral service for counterculture. I think the
Yeah.
funeral service for sexual revolution because it says that ultimately sex is disappointing. I think that this is what the movie really says. And having Marlon Brando also in his late 40s, I think was it that, or even early 50s, in the movie was significant. But she loved it. I think it spoke to her sense that movies are adult enough as an art to take on the most uncomfortable subjects. And she says it in the review that Henry Miller in prose, this is it, and
I
that
think it looked like Aeneas Nin or Henry Miller, and it was this Tropic of Cancer,
yeah.
this idea that, and I think Pauline Kael talks a lot about writing about erotic sort of themes, and that kind of set her apart as well. She was kind of a farm girl from Petaluma. She was talking a lot about this sort of thing, and
The titles of her books are always sexually indicative. Like I lost it.
can you name some of
I
them
lost it at
just so
the
I don't have to?
yeah. I lost deeper
Yeah.
into movies, taking it all in, hooked, movie laugh. She was famous for it. I think from a certain point it was almost like a game. That she knew that her next book they will expect that she will give her this sexually title, and she did write about she. I think she was very like. However, I think she was interested in sex. Like
Yeah,
as
yeah,
cultural
yeah,
phenomenon, and probably also in the 50s I would say that she was in a very liberal you know I don't know how the 50s beatnik culture in some ways I think it was even more adventurous than the 1990s culture. you know
and I think her problem with William Shawn was like, what's the problem with this? This is real. This is how people really think. How come I can't write it? And he was saying from the Protestant kind of waspy sort
yeah
of literary background, he says we can't use the words in movie reviews. Sorry. And she was saying, why not? Because this is how I'm thinking. This is what I'm thinking about. He would edit it out, and I think his quote was, "We can't use this ever, and we won't use this ever. So get it out of this article about Jack Nicholson." And so why don't we leave that a little bit and just say that she was ahead of her time on that in that aspect and go into the 1970s where she was really instrumental in making the careers of Coppola and The Godfather. And what did she think about The Godfather? And
Oh yeah,
that
she
you know, you know,
at one point I found a piece in which she mentioned that this was the best American movie ever made. The really, it's either this or sometimes she refers to Intolerance. The Griff,
mm,
she, I think that she recognized it as the closest that American culture got to producing the great American novel. Like the one film that encapsulates in epic terms the American experience, both with its promise of those people who came from Italy, with its sordid side, the violence, the so and apart from it being fantastically made and like
you
really,
know.
and she didn't like the novel, she didn't like the Mario Puzo's novel, but she said that in this movie that really like it represented the best that American cinema had to offer in terms of epic storytelling.
What did she like about this? I know that she liked these Italians because I think she thought they were not Protestant and they were really living life and the colors were vibrant and there was something emotional about this film that I think we take for granted now. But let's go back to 1972 when The Godfather came out. That was pretty new. That's
I think it's super interesting because basically she responded a lot to Italian American
yeah,
directors at the time. I think precisely because they were the ones who were leaving the shackles of this sort of restraint. Like Catholics had a lot of pent up energy. I would say that the sexual revolution allowed them. Scorsese,
yeah,
with Coppola, De
yeah.
Palma, who is a very sexual director as well. There's
And
a
she
lot of
loved De Palma, right? And she
and
loved
she loved De
Scorsese,
Palma.
and she wrote a very positive review of Mean Streets by
Yeah,
Scorsese, which kind of put him on the map, right? Is it safe to say that Pauline Kael helped Scorsese become?
absolutely. And he he
Yeah, yeah.
he he acknowledges that much, and if you look.
How so? Can you tell that story?
Oh yeah, he mentioned that I think in one of the documentaries that he really appreciated that review, and early Scorsese is all about the Catholic guilt. There's this
Yeah,
character of Harry
Johnny Boy
Johnny
or
Boy, and
you
Harvey
know,
Keitel plays this very tortured Catholic soul, like
yeah,
torn between the flesh and the spirit. He was supposed to be a priest.
yeah,
So there's a lot of cultural tension there, and I think in movie terms this tension translated into some pretty great art. And this is something that Kale was she was much more responsive to that than she was to a lot of the Jewish cultural like concerns of the time. She's very critical when of the movies like based on Philip Roth's novel, for example, some Goodbye Columbus, wasn't it? Or Portland,
Courtney's Complaint, Goodbye
yeah.
Columbus, with the one with Richard Benjamin, and
But she's
just,
much she seems to be closer like to those directors from the Catholic background, and
and I think it's because they don't have any guilt. I mean, the whole thing about Philip Roth novels is about guilt. I think the Scorsese and Ford Coppola novels are about getting rid of your guilt and just
yeah.
living your life. And I think she felt like that the shackles are unbound and the 70s are coming, bring it on, you
Yes,
know?
but she wasn't naive that the once out of your shackles that everything will be great. She knew that she wasn't naive. She wasn't sentimental. So what she liked was this group of very intelligent, super talented, filmmakers who were transforming the art at the same time transforming themselves. She had a close friendship for a while with Paul Schrader, the director, well, the writer of Taxi Driver. Later on, she treated, I think, very maliciously in her reviews. But he was also of very religious background. I think he a Calvinist back. He
Yeah.
also sort of came out of the shell. So
Let's segue after The Godfather, which you reviewed very favorably, Mean Streets, two Italian directors that kind of introduces a new genre into American cinema in the early 1970s. She liked Greatest or Last American Hero, which we talked about on a previous podcast about the
the
Tom
Lambert
Wolfe
Johnson film, yeah.
article, and she loved that film. And she was very unpredictable. I think one of the appealing things about Pauline Kael is you never knew what she would think. She was very unpredictable, and she was very opinionated. But when she had an opinion, she stuck with it. Can you think of any films like that in the early 70s that other critics hated, but she
Mhm.
loved? Maybe we can even talk about some of this. She didn't like Casablanca. She didn't like Kubrick. She didn't like Meryl Streep. All
And
of these kind of
this is a side of her that I think, we need to also mention, that she knew how influential she was. I think that sometimes, at least this is some people told me that who knew her, that she would like wait to hear what's the like general opinion of the film, and then she would opine.
yeah.
But I think she was very honest in her responses. I mean, for her, probably the biggest cause celebre of a film that she really praised in advance, even before it was finished, which was
Yeah.
controversial, was Nashville.
Yeah.
Who, by the way, also is of Catholic background, if I'm not mistaken,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
from
Yeah.
Texas. But
Can we talk about this film, Nashville? What's it about?
Nashville
If
is a,
yeah.
one huge piece of a film. It's a three
Yeah. Yeah.
hour
Yeah. Yeah.
multi narrative of of this one day in Nashville on a music festival.
Yeah.
Various people connected to politics and music are in Nashville, and then there's a political murder that's attempt
Uh-huh.
at least going on, and famously, the character of played by Barbara Harris sings this song. The last scene, you can say that I ain't free, but it don't worry me. Which is the sort of ironic commentary, and it was the centennial also. So she loved the exuberance of Altman. She loved she loved that he loved his characters. She was big on it. Didn't like directors who were superior to their characters.
And she took on a couple of giants, right? She didn't like Hitchcock,
She wasn't.
famously. She didn't like Psycho, or she thought it was kind of, and she took on Orson Welles in a famous essay, and that caused her some problems, right? That because
Yeah,
Orson Welles is a legend. Maybe tell us something about that. She wrote a very famous piece suggesting that Orson Welles took too much credit for Citizen Kane, right? Yeah.
Raising Cain is a piece that she published in 1971, a very
Yeah.
long essay, which actually ran in two parts in the New Yorker, and
Yeah.
it had its own TV ad. Believe it or not, it was a time that
I
an
didn't
essay
know.
with
Yeah.
it's a complicated piece, very long, very rich. One
Yeah.
facet of the piece is, bringing up attention to Herman Mankiewicz, who was the screenwriter of Citizen Kane, and taking away a bit of the Wallace legend. I think,
Hmm.
if you read the piece closely, it's very clear how much she admired Wallace. She
Yeah.
wrote a separate piece in the 60s in which she said that, he's probably the best living, something like that. Liked him, but
Yeah.
I think she was irked by the fact that, so many people were adhering to the author theory of the time, credited
Yeah.
solely the director. Went a little bit too far in some parts of
Okay.
Raising
Okay.
Cain, but there are parts of the essay that are
Yeah.
brilliant. She really she gave a full
Okay.
interpretation of Citizen Kane. So yeah, I was annoyed because now with the new film Mank, many people
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
saying, Pauline Kael was wrong, and when I read their pieces, I knew that they didn't read the essay. They
Okay.
just that they heard that it's the essay about Orson Welles not being the author of Citizen Kane. It's much more. It's much more than that.
And one of the things about Pauline Kael that set her apart also is she wasn't afraid to take on her rivals, and her rivals criticized her. She had a famous rival in the Village Voice.
Andrew
What do we know about him?
Andrew Cyrus, yeah, who was really the high priest of the auteur theory. He
What is the auteur theory for the viewers who don't know film?
one sentence it says that the main author of the film is the director, and
And she disagreed with this.
she
Yeah.
disagreed with that. She disagreed with it, and auteur theory, which was probably the single most influential theory within American film criticism, and it transformed everything. It's a great movement. It was a great movement for Pauline Kael, though. There was too much of cult of personality involved. The
Oh,
famous line of author theorists was that even the worst film by a good director is more interesting than a good film by a mediocre director, and she could never stand for that. So she was very annoyed that they would praise late films by Howard Hawks like El Dorado or Red 7000, which she said were very bad, but they praised them still because they were by Howard Hawks. So that's why she disagreed. And yeah, she wrote a quite malicious piece about Saris, which is a
Yeah.
great read, but I don't agree
Yeah.
with everything that she says. Yeah. Mhm.
Well, Michał, we've talked about this, and we're in academia, and journalists are the same way. Sometimes the smallest disputes are not about the actual film reviews, but the disputes within each other. And I think it's safe to say that Pauline Kael was a fighter,
Mhm.
and she didn't want to be. She had a very anti-authoritarian aspect to her personality, especially against people from the high culture.
Mhm.
And I think that was part of her debate with Sarah. He was a little bit more
Definitely.
sophisticated.
And this whole feud is now it's part of the history of film criticism. It's not like it's fueling any new passions. But yeah.
But she was a populist. She liked these kind of films, and we've talked about it before. She would actually talk about the audience reaction during the film. You would never do that if you were writing about theater, right? I mean,
Mhm.
she had this very raw kind of what the film meant to me is what I'm going to put down on my pencil and my notepad right after I get out of the film, and that was part of her persona, and that was part of her legacy of the '70s. And you said that was her golden era, right? The '70s.
Oh yeah.
She liked De Palma. Why did she like De Palma so much?
Well, she liked De Palma because his movies were violent and sexy and elegant at the same time. That was
Oh,
he was an extreme stylist, and at the
could
same
we say what for the general viewer? Who's Brian De Palma? What are some of his
Yeah,
most famous?
Brian De Palma is, New Jersey born, I think, but no,
Yeah,
or was he Philadelphia born? Well, he was part of this new wave of American film, and
yeah.
in the '60s he was very influenced by Godard. He made those crazy films like Greetings, but then in the '70s he basically started to create those highly stylized horror and thriller movies like Carrie, Sisters, Fury, which were incredibly beautiful to look at, perfectly crafted, sensuous, and a little bit perverted. I would say, there was always like this gleam in the eye that was a little bit dirty,
She loved Dress to Kill with Michael Caine and Angie Dickinson, and that
yes,
was De Palma. And
yeah.
Blowout. De Palma did Dress to Kill. I remember watching that on cable TV when I was about 13 years old, and it made me a man in a way because
Right.
it was very Hitchcockian in a way. But why did she like De Palma and not like Hitchcock? Is there any
That's a good,
academic theory on that?
that's a fair
Yeah,
question. I
yeah,
think
yeah.
that she. Wait a second. She didn't review any of the Hitchcocks like
Okay.
directly. She never. I think that I would say this. She was suspicious of the kind of manipulation that Hitchcock was applying to his audience, but she was much
Yeah.
into the kind of manipulation that Brian De Palma was putting his audience at. And this is a matter, I think, of personal
Oh,
taste. I would think
okay.
that would be indefensible on intellectual grounds. She was simply more into De Palma's brand of perverse genre play. I think.
I think one of the things about Pauline Kael is that her reviews about the films she didn't like that everybody else did like were the most famous. She didn't like The Sting. She hated Star Wars. She
Yeah.
liked Jaws, and she said Jaws was like a comedy. She said she laughed all the way through Jaws, and which
Mhm.
to me is a funny statement.
Right.
But she says the blockbuster of the mid '70s ruined cinema, and she cites Star Wars as being the beginning of the end to era of 1970s films. Why didn't she like Star Wars? What was her problem with it?
I think she was spot on. I think she
Yeah,
exactly knew that this
yeah,
film will change everything, because and the
yeah,
one
yeah,
sentence that she wrote in that very short review, by the way, uncharacteristically short, was that the movie is like a box of Cracker Jacks that is all prizes and nothing but sugar. It's like this is like the movie like injects sugar into your veins and it gives you this high, but there's nothing else.
But it made a lot of money. But the other movie that we talked about on your podcast, Saturday Night Fever, she did like Saturday Night Fever. Why?
There is gravity to Saturday Night Fever. As we talked,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's a movie that
yeah,
really touches on some difficult issues. Star
yeah,
Wars is a ride. And she did like some of those purely escapist films. Like she loved Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom, the Sugar Rush. Sometimes, but
yeah,
sensed that by 1985 something really wrong was going on. That there were simply no movies like the movies of the 70s that would be adult films, that would really appeal to adult sensibilities. And I think that she was right. By mid 1980s, that wave's already gone.
Could you imagine Pauline Kael reviewing Goonies or
There,
or something like that? Like or Staying Alive compared to
she,
Saturday Night
yeah,
Fever.
she did review both. I mean, Staying
She
Alive.
did. What did she say about Staying
She
Alive?
hated it. It was a very funny review. I don't remember the specifics, but she hated
Yeah,
Staying Alive. She knew that that the thing about 1980s, I think, was that there was Hollywood became purely corporate. Also, it
yeah,
was managed, and it was all about the next blockbuster. How much this
yeah.
movie will make. How do we put teenagers in cinema seats. And for a while, I think there was many there was a lot of good entertainment coming out of Hollywood, but after a while, I think there was just too much of this adolescent, infantile
And
mindset.
Pauline Kael, I mean, if you're thinking about Vietnam films or whatever, I can't imagine her reviewing Rambo with any kind of seriousness or something. Like there's something about the 80s that changed. She was very famous in a way for having a negative review of Showa, the Klansman
Yeah,
film. And you wrote a really insightful article about how she didn't really like to touch European films, or at least her origin story of East Central Europe. Is that,
yeah.
do you remember anything about that?
I didn't solve the
Yeah.
riddle, but I did write a piece for Cineast magazine a couple of years ago, uh, because I sensed a sort of a dislike in her writing of films that came from Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
There was some, the way she reviewed Milos Forman's films, the Czech
Yeah.
ones and the American ones, and some other.
It's like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. You didn't like it?
Well, that one she was sort of split on. It's a fascinating
Okay.
review, by the way. It's really
Okay.
good, because the
Yeah.
first half of the review is basically a big essay on Ken Kesey, and then she goes
Yeah.
into.
Yeah.
I can send you the review, but
Yeah.
yeah, she there was something that she was, I think, and this is also, I talked about the people who knew her, maybe not uneasy, that would be too much a word, about her Jewish identity, but she definitely belonged to a generation of American Jews also, who really didn't have this strong connection to the old world. She never visited Poland. She never reviewed a film that would be, well, from this part of the world. She wouldn't basically touch it. There are very few reviews of her that even mention this part of the world, which I find curious,
Okay.
because someone so omnivorous in terms of intellectual energy, when she reviewed
Yeah.
The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which, by the way,
Yeah.
she loved. But she loved everything that was not Czech about it. That is a curious case for me, and as Showa review, I think that's part of the story. But I don't have enough material to say this, but I think there was some kind of she was very secular. By the way, she was very secular.
Yeah.
This for sure. She defined herself as a secular person, and I think that she wanted to be a modern American woman, I think.
Yeah. There's some echoes of that. I mean, it reminded me of the very famous case of Hannah Arendt reviewing Eichmann in Jerusalem in the pages of the New Yorker in the early 1960s, and there was a similar kind of criticism against Arendt, European Jew, writing about a very difficult time and kind of becoming the origins of banality of evil. And maybe people felt the same thing about Pauline Kael reviewing Shoah, because Shoah, I mean, what was Shoah about? I mean, for the general audience, it was a
Shoah,
very long film.
9-hour film that basically is, the documents the Holocaust, but through a very specific method, which is it doesn't include any archival footage, not a frame. It only includes current interviews with the survivors. So any shots of Auschwitz, any shots of the places where the Holocaust took place are contemporary shots. It makes a very clear point of not bringing you to the past only through the words of that are being spoken. And it's a harrowing film, which has absolutely horrific stories. She famously said that it's too long. That she barely sat through the second half. Each half is 4.5 hours long, and that she basically found the Claude Lanzmann's approach like one-sided. She says that the movie, this is a quote, that the movie closes your mind instead of opening it, and that it focuses on the Holocaust in a very one-sided way. This is her argument that she was making, and there was a huge controversy over that piece. I talked to Jim Hoberman, who at the same time wrote for Village Voice, and he wrote a very polemical piece with Kael that ended with this sort of caustic one-liner that Kael said in her review that something to the effect that Lanzmann is the kind of a guy who would find anti-Semitism anywhere, and Hoberman responded, and this is the last line of his piece, is that well, if that's the case, then who knows? If we unleash Lanzmann, maybe he even will find anti-Semitism in the New Yorker. And that was basically saying, straight on that she made an anti-Semitic statement, which was of course complicated by the fact that she was Jew herself. So she was Jewish. So there was this bitter feud over that piece, and I think that even William Shawn didn't want to run it after she saw the first part. He made her see the second part, and after she saw it, I think she came with a chip on her shoulder already, and she wrote this very, very, angry piece. And it's fascinating, the whole case. But yeah, she continued to review pieces. But this tells you that she was really controversial. It wasn't like just like some superficial controversy. She really cut.
She was, I think, in the early 1950s. If you're living in the San Francisco Bay Area, she had a lot of interactions with the gay community, which she was very comfortable with, which I think most people weren't in the 1950s and 60s. And she let that into her film reviews. But she was accused of being homophobic over a review about Rich and Famous. What was that one about?
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing with her and the gay community. I mean, she was, when in Berkeley, was also mentioned by many people, she was surrounded by gay people. I mean, she was really like, she was gravitating towards
at a time when it was not common. I mean, it was very underground at that time.
There's tons of reviews that in which she felt very comfortable in the community. I think by the early 80s, which also marks a turning point for the gay movement. It's on the verge of the AIDS crisis, and there's this very strong, it begins the very strong identity politics also within the gay movement. Suddenly the way that she was cracking jokes suddenly maybe became too casual for some. And when she accused the Rich and Famous of being like a homosexual fantasy, and saying basically, and I don't even think that George Cukor, the director of the film, who was gay, but I don't think he was openly gay. So the review was almost an act of outing, like saying, "Oh, here's this old gay director who basically doesn't even know how heterosexual relationships are like." And that's when there was a controversy. There's so much of her writing is extremely like comfortable with gay people. Personal Best, the film about the lesbian athlete,
Margot Hemingway.
she loved that movie. She absolutely she absolutely loved it,
And I think the evidence of that is that she's talking about it openly in reviews when nobody else was in
of
the
course,
60s.
of
You know
course,
what I mean? And then all of a sudden she's still talking about it openly in the 80s, and people say, "Oh, that's terrible what you say." And she
yeah.
says, "Hey, that's just what I think."
Fact that some of the reviews that she I mean, if anybody has any doubts about her being homophobic, I would only recommend her to read the review of Law of Desire, the Pedro Almodovar film, which she loved to pieces, and
Uh-huh.
it's basically like a love letter to the gay characters, I would say. So yeah,
Oh.
but it's true. There were moments when she was at odds with the gay community.
She's an honest person, and she owned it, right? I mean,
Yeah,
she,
yeah. She didn't
yeah, yeah.
backtrack or anything. So this is also why I'm saying that in a Twitter culture, it will be much more difficult. Twitter culture is all
Yeah,
about pinning that one screenshot
yeah,
on you of saying like 4 years ago you said this, and now
yeah.
you should be. So, oh, but this is now. Luckily, she cannot be attacked anymore.
And Michał, I knew you when you were doing your PhD topic on her, and we talked about it how ever since you've done that, even since you've done that, there's been a biography about her, a
Yes.
documentary about her,
Yes.
and a lot of people talk about how big of an influence that she was. I think I'm the only person that didn't watch her on the Dick Cavett show when I was a kid because I was reading Sports Illustrated, but or I wasn't reading the New Yorker. But I read an article about Wes Anderson showed her Rushmore, and
Mhm.
yeah,
Important
yeah,
thing about Kale, I think in the
yeah,
early 80s or mid 80s, she was
yeah,
diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. She struggled to come to New York. At one point,
yeah,
she bought a house in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. She would come to New York. She would stay for a few days. She would watch all of the films that she was supposed to watch, and then she would write, in between Massachusetts and New York. And she was struggling with Parkinson's. I think she fainted after one of the screenings. She was a woman of certain age by then,
yeah,
her 60s.
yeah.
So later on, when she was basically living in Great Barrington, she retired from reviewing in 1991. The last review that she wrote was of the Steve Martin film L.A. Story. Yeah,
Which was a really superficial movie about plastic Los Angeles, and
yeah, exactly. And the thing is that she was beloved by many filmmakers. There's even the filmmakers that she gave bad reviews. Famously, Woody Allen liked her a lot, even though
you know.
she didn't like most of. But
Well, the famous take from the documentary, Jerry Lewis saying he's on the Dick Cavett show, and Jerry
yes,
Lewis is saying she never wrote anything good about me,
yeah,
like
yeah.
a
He said
dirty
disdain,
broad or something like
broad,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But she knows her stuff. She says that she really knows. She's knowledgeable.
Jerry Lewis says she doesn't like me, but she knows her stuff,
Yeah,
which is kind of a backhanded compliment in the best way,
yeah,
So
absolutely. And people would come to Great Barrington, and the local theater would run the movies that they, this is the 35
yeah,
millimeter
yeah,
prints now, and she would watch them at the local theater. And I know for sure that there was a screening of Rushmore. There was a screening of Rushmore, and I'm not sure, but they might have been a screening of Pulp Fiction as well.
let's get to Tarantino. He really respected her,
Oh,
right? He said
a
he
lot.
grew up reading New Yorker pieces by Pauline Kael, and you could see it in his grindhouse. He had this kind of attitude that there was something deeper in film, and Pauline Kael had that,
He
and
said
he,
that
yeah,
that
yeah,
reading her is the best film school. That's what he said.
really,
Said that he quoted, I think, in the documentary, the Rob Garver documentary. He says something like, I this like when you look at the title, Pulp Fiction, it's all about what Pauline Kael loved. That she saw poetry in the Pulp Fiction of America. Tarantino has been doing for the past 25 years.
and I guess Reservoir Dogs came out the year that she retired, or the year after. So
the year
he kind of,
after, we know that she saw
yeah,
Pulp Fiction and she liked it. She,
yeah,
I
yeah.
think she didn't love it, but I think she liked it. And
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
I don't know what her reservations were, but by then I know that she was watching a lot of television. She loved The Sopranos, at least the
She likes
first season.
Sopranos, and
Yeah,
she likes Sex in the City, and
Sex and the City.
And what about your personal relationship with her? I know that you have one. Can you explain it? How was it?
Well, I met Gina. I met
Yeah,
Pauline Kael died a few days before 9/11. Right? She
yeah,
died literally,
yeah,
I think, a week before
yeah,
9/11. I of
yeah,
course I never met her. I met many people who knew her friends and enemies.
yeah.
And I met Gina James, who's really such a gracious person. We
That's her daughter, right?
lives in Great Barrington.
Yeah.
She lives in Great Barrington. I actually have a picture of her and myself here on the wall because it was a very important meeting in my life, to actually meet Jean. I felt like I knew her already.
Maybe we can talk about Gina did most of the work, right? I mean, or not most of the work, but she had to type because Pauline Kael didn't know how to type, right? So
She
Gina
didn't know
had to
how
do
to
all the work.
drive. She
So,
didn't know
yeah.
how to drive, so I think Gina also drove her around. She didn't
Okay.
type.
Yeah.
So it's interesting for a California girl not to know how, but still, Gina, she's very, very sweet. She spent a lot of time with her mother because, when they lived together in New York, she would really be the person to, type up all the things. Apparently, from what I understand, I don't want to, make any false. I think
Yeah.
that, Kale always wrote in pencil. Then she would leave the pencil, longhand on the desk, and by the morning there would be the typed up version, so that's what Gina would do. Very, close ties.
Yeah.
But I also know that, when Gina James spoke about it, and some people spoke about it, that Pauline Kael sometimes was strong-minded to the point of being obnoxious, and to being really unable to accept that other people thought differently, and that was her darker side, that her empathy
Yeah.
capabilities and her, let's say, capabilities of compromise, that was both her strength and her weakness,
And
hold her ground. She didn't have the sense that, sometimes a little bit of compromise is also good.
and I think a lot of great artists have that quality or disquality that they think they are right and they are only right, and anybody else who doesn't agree with them is wrong.
Yeah.
And in the film criticism world, she butted up with a lot of people that had egos. That was probably what made Pauline Kael Pauline Kael. If she didn't have adversaries, she wouldn't have been the person that she
Yeah,
was, I
and
think,
she wouldn't survive as a female critic in the 50s and 60s. So she
for
needed
sure.
she needed to grow that sort of
She
uh
had to be strong,
yeah.
and she was. She's a great voice of American literature. I think if you read her reviews, I think they're some of the best literature in American history, really. I mean, she's got this stream of consciousness style of hers where she's reviewing a movie, but she's reviewing the world
Yeah.
and the time she lived. Well, thank you,
Absolutely.
Michał. And anything to
Thank you.
add?
Real pleasure, and I hope
Yeah,
that we get to discuss
yeah,
movies soon. On this podcast or on my podcast. It's nice that we meet on this podcast platform. Real
real
pleasure.
cool.
So anytime you need me, I'm there. My cat is making an appearance now.
Oh, I see your cat.
The
We
current
had a cat.
owner.
The cat was the
Yeah,
theme. Last time we had a cat, we had Gilda. What is your cat's name?
her name is
What,
Cookie. Her name is Cookie. Yeah.
Cookie. Hello, Cookie. You're
So
famous.
famous now.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Thank
Well,
you so
Michał, it's been a
much.
pleasure. It's always a pleasure, and we're
Same,
old friends. And
same here.
so
Same here.
let's talk soon. And congratulations on everything you've done. And we'll talk
Same here.
soon in the near future.
See
All
you
right.
soon, Patrick. Bye bye.
Bye bye.